This morning we heard the voices of those who represent the most important political movements in the 20th century, those of Gandhi and Dr. Martin Luther King. We had the fortune of listening to those voices this morning. The person whom I have the fortune of introducing represents not only a continuation of those political struggles, but is the only person who is equipped not only intellectually, but has the guts to deal with the current collapsing economic and cultural system. And believe me, I've done my research. His intellectual and political leadership has inspired leaders and young people across the world to fight for a new just world economic system. Through his strategic battles, he has severely crippled the efforts of Dick Cheney and other scumbags across the world. So without further introduction, I present to you the next President of the United States, Lyndon LaRouche.
Well, thank you, Jenny. Okay. Young fellows. Well, I shall deal with several things in the time allotted to me, and then the time allotted to you, you will ask me what you wish to. We divide things that way, and you get more time than I do. All right, first of all, the three things are first, the essential thing about economy in principle. Secondly, the second thing about economy, which is twofold, is the relationship of the economic activity of the individual or small firm to the community at large, the nation as a large, the world at large, and the social processes which connect the coordination of various individual or local activities into a national functioning whole. And then finally, I shall turn to the reasons why the synergists exist and why there's such a danger to us and we to them. And that, all right, now first of all, as I've said in the course of things at the conference, the great fakery which affects people when you mention the word economics is money. They try to explain a system of money which is a sound system, they argue, for running an economy. And as I said, a system of money is insane intrinsically, because it's only paper, it's arbitrary, it has no physical content. Did you ever see money plow a field? Did you ever see a coin talking? If you did, you should talk to about that. All right, so therefore, money has no intrinsic value, nor does gold have an intrinsic value as a currency. These things have determined values by the processes in which they function. Money is merely a medium of exchange. It is necessary because society is composed of tightly integrated and complex social relations. And therefore, in order to process the exchange of goods and other things, you need money as a measure of the social political process of exchange. Money properly is created only by a government, not by anybody else. One of the great evils we have to contend with is money being created by private interests who then sell money on the market for a price, such as central banking systems or private family-style merchant banks, which create currency and demand a monopoly among themselves, among the bankers, of a control over a currency. This is where the problem arises. Because then when this group gets control over the value of money, the power to determine its value by interest rates, yields, and so forth, then man becomes a victim of paper. And evil takes over. So the important thing is, how should we define the production of a necessary medium of exchange called money, or credit issued against money, or charge against the delivery of money? How should we measure that, and how should we control that? Well, obviously it has to be done by a sovereign government. Why? Because the process of production and distribution depends upon a relationship between the income of the individual or firm or entity which consumes and those who produce. In general, the objective is that the cost of production should be less than the price of the goods sold. But that's on the average. The root of this thing is very simple. The root of an economy is man. There's no economy among animals, including Arnold Schwarzenegger. There is no proper economy. An economy reflects a characteristic of people, of the human individual, the difference between the individual and the beast. That is, these cognitive powers by which we discover universal physical principles, derive new technologies or apply technology based on these principles. We apply them to our problems. And therefore we find that through our efforts, our physical efforts, or the expenditure of our time, that we are able to produce more wealth than it costs to keep us in the process of production, both in terms of our labor, in terms of the cost to maintain the families from which we come, but also in the cost to society of capital expenditures on which we rely, both in private industry and by government, including large-scale infrastructure, things of that sort. We rely upon this. Our productivity depends upon it. And therefore, it is the power of man to make discoveries and to use them, discoveries derived from discovery of universal physical principles, which increases the value of what is produced over the cost of production. And therefore, essentially, economy starts with purely physical values in the sense of the physical values dependent upon man's ability to discover universal physical principles and to derive and apply technologies obtained through these discoveries. That is real economics. Now, this economics has two essential features. One, which we already discussed in the process of the conference repeatedly. On the one side, we have what we call universal physical principles per se. These are discoveries of principles which an individual mind makes. Maybe many individual minds make them, but they each make them individually. You don't learn, you don't have a creative process in which somebody makes a discovery and then gets out and describes the discovery to others, and that is not actually transmitting the discovery. That is, the people who receive this instruction, this learning, do not really know what they're talking about. Only the person who creates the idea or who recreates the discovery of the idea actually knows what he or she is talking about. Only he or she is qualified to understand how to apply what is described to those who merely learn. And therefore, it is the participation of people in reenacting discoveries from the past and applying them socially which is the source of the increase of wealth. And therefore, without that process, which includes the process of education, maturation, family relations, and so forth, classical artistic forms of productions, all these things go together to enable human beings to make discoveries of principle, to reenact those discoveries, to apply those principles to practice, and to know how to use tools which are relevant to these kinds of discoveries. And that's how wealth is produced, essentially, from the standpoint of the individual. When we're talking about the individual entrepreneur who runs a small firm, his primary function is as a mediation of these kinds of discoveries or their technologies derived from them. He's become a master of applying these technologies to something for some purpose. He's able to use his judgment in such a way that these things are successful in actually producing more wealth for society in net effect than the cost of that production. That's a simple physical relationship, like the relationship of the individual mind to the discovery of a universal physical principle. Then you have the second aspect. Now let's suppose that you have a very intelligent fellow. He's plunked down somewhere on the planet. He's given a machine tool and so forth, all the materials needed to produce. Is that going to determine his productivity? No. What's going to determine its productivity is the educational system in which that population lives, the level of infrastructure, such as the production and distribution of power, the degree to which the environment is controlled by large-scale water management, by forestation, all these other things which are the conditions of life. The conditions of social life determine how productive the individual entrepreneur, the individual worker will be in society. So it is not from the individual labor as such that the wealth comes. The ability of man to produce more than the cost of production depends not only on the individual, it depends upon the conditions of life in society in which that individual operates. Therefore, we have the division in economy, which is modern national economy. The division between the activity of the individual as individual, using technologies or perfecting the application of technologies derived from universal physical principles, from the mind of the individual. The individual mind's relationship to nature is the primary thing there. But that does not determine the productivity of labor. What determines the productivity of labor variably is the conditions of society in which this is done. So therefore you have in economy two things to consider. You have the local activity, and you also have then the organization of the society as a whole. The national infrastructure, water management, educational systems, healthcare systems, all of these things which are the responsibility primarily of government. Because it is only government that should own, essentially, all of the territory of a nation. It is government is responsible for all of the territory, whether it is being used productively or not. For example, the quality of transportation will affect productivity of the individual firm. Two firms of equal productivity will vary in their net productivity based on such things as transportation. Now, if you have to get out and spend 2 hours a day each way in that parking lot, which is called a superhighway, to commute to work, to and from work, that is taking time out of your life. Time out of your life which is essentially wasted relative to what should be a rapid transit system for mass transit, which would convey you efficiently and quickly to where you go. Similarly, if you diversify in the form of moving industries out from the cities to far distances from those cities, centers of population, you increase the cost of production and may throw the rate of profit of the economy physically into a negative category. Because if people have to travel too far to get to work or to or from work, then you increase the cost of production. So therefore, efficient high-speed transport is an essential part. Also, organizing cities in such a way that places of work are conveniently situated. The best kind of city is one in which you can work at several firms and they're all within walking distance of where you live, or within reasonable mass transit connections of a few minutes between where you reside and where you work. That makes for an efficient city. It makes for efficiency of production. This moving out to the suburbs, the development of suburbia in the post-war period, is an example of insanity by governments. Let's take the case of New York City. New York City was a terrible city because it was controlled by the worst people in the United States, or the semi-worst. These were the people, the financial interests that controlled New York City. Since the time of that great traitor to the United States, Aaron Burr, who created the Bank of Manhattan as a swindle under franchise from his patron in Britain, Jeremy Bentham, who is probably the worst pig of recent several centuries. So the city was set up as an exploitation center with great immigration flows into New York City in particular, at the time that it was its great port. You had a system in New York City which is set up to absorb immigrants. And you came into New York as a greenhorn, and you were dumped into the lowest category of habitation and the poorest. After maybe a couple of decades, you work your way up to a slightly higher level of habitation. Your children might actually live in better quarters than you did, and their children might live in better quarters than they did. But the whole thing was a machine for grinding up greenhorns, essentially, and using them for cheap labor. But around Greater New York, because of the requirements and because of the maritime center it was, we had in northern New Jersey and around New York, you had a concentration of industry. That actually New York City, or Greater New York, was one of the great industrial centers of the United States. Not always the heaviest industry, but fairly important. Most of that has now disappeared. New York City is a place where you have to be a prostitute to afford living, a high-priced prostitute at that, to afford living in an apartment building. That's New York City today. But so what they did at the end of the war, they made a decision. It was one of those Truman-type decisions. The decision was to take the potato patches in Long Island and set up what became known as Levittown. These were little shacks, better than these $500,000 shacks you can get around here. Yeah? But they were shacks nonetheless, and people moved out there. So now you had a process of decentralization, the development of suburbia. Then you had one of the top officials of Sears Roebuck operating out of Philadelphia, who looked at a phenomenon called the National Defense Highway, which was being developed under the influence of President Eisenhower. And they said, well, let's take this area, and if we attach to this National Defense Highway, if we do some suburban development and put up shopping center malls and build housing, suburban housing around these malls and decentralize, we can make a lot of money out of turning potato patches into residential areas. And in the process, areas like Philadelphia, which were affected, began to collapse, disintegrate. So we went from a society which had been developed as the great productive engineering capacity of the world, the United States, and we began to decentralize it, and after the middle of the 1960s, we began to destroy it. The same thing has happened in Germany. People will commute over restricted highways in a country which has not got the lowest population density, and they'll commute as much as 2 hours each way or something like that each day to and from work to a mountain area far distant from Frankfurt and Wiesbaden and Mainz, to a distant location. Whereas in the 1970s, you had in a place like Wiesbaden in particular, you would have a lot of people who would be living in the city at prices of rent they could afford. And the places of employment were generally close to the city. So it was a much more efficient. So you had a decline, a decay of efficiency of the economy through this kind of mismanagement of the economy as a whole, as distinct from the particular enterprise within which production is occurring, farm or so forth. Other things were introduced. So therefore, the conditions which are determined largely by government at the federal or national or regional or local level, and especially the government's role in respect to infrastructure, such as power production and distribution, such as land improvements, water management, mass transit, education, healthcare, and organizing places of work so that you have an integrated urban-suburban arrangement which is efficient in which to situate the particular production as such. Now, people say it was to move away from the smokestacks, but that was not the reason. We have the ability to eliminate the smokestacks with existing technology. We have nuclear power, for example, which I could say something in particular. And not to go to nuclear power and not to go on to the development of fusion power is an act of criminal insanity when done by governments. And the reason we didn't do it is because somebody decided to brainwash some young people in the middle of the 1960s and beyond to say that technology is bad. And having started in saying technology is bad, they went on and said, we've got to get rid of nuclear technology. We've got to go back to burning things again. Or cranking up your bicycle as a local power unit. Or windmills. You know, you just say, I know why Don Quixote was needed. to get rid of those damn windmills. And so in any case, so the role of government in providing large-scale infrastructure is an essential part of the ability to produce of the local firm, both in terms of production itself and in terms of providing the conditions of life, including social life as well as individual life, in which the relationship between production and consumption and life in general is organized in a rational way. This cheapens the amount of effort required to produce and increases the productive powers of labor by providing cheap power, abundant power of ever higher quality, water, so forth, the whole business. It's much less expensive to provide any service within an urban area which is properly developed than anywhere else. So cities are good. Suburbia can be bad. If you don't believe it, live in one. Wait till the houses go bankrupt here. These $500,000 to $1 million shrink-wrap built shacks out there with plastic exteriors. They have 1/10 of an inch of concrete or cement or brick attached to the outside, hung on the outside as decoration. And inside it's a shrink-wrap shack. And it's not worth 1/10 of the value they put on the mortgage these days. So anyway, so that's the second aspect. The third aspect, which is under the second also, is the question of the way in which social relations are organized. The most important part of this is the way the individual is considered, the way the social process is considered. How do we define man? How do we define the individual? How do you define the individual's needs? What are the individual's needs? Now, in my time, backwardness, as expressed by my father, who was on some things quite backward sociologically, was if you're not being paid for the time you're expending effort, you have no right to any income. That doesn't cost you anything. So if you're doing something very inefficiently and you're not being paid for what you're doing, there's nothing wrong in your having to do it by the worst possible method, because your time is worth nothing. If your time is not being paid for, it's worth nothing. Well, that's not true. One of my fights with my parents and others in my childhood. My time is precious because my time is the time I use to develop myself. And the essential thing about us is our development. We're not animals, we're not monkeys produced like all monkeys before us. We're human beings who are capable of assimilating the contributions, cultural contributions of previous generations. We're capable of solving problems that are left over from previous generations. And whatever we do to develop ourselves to play that role in society or to promote the development of culture is essential to society. The productive power, the productive potential of the population depends upon the development of the individual. Most of this development does not occur on the job. As with children, it occurs before they go to work or before they should be asked to go to work. It's the development of the individual. And the quality of development allowed to the individual is crucial in determining the potential productive power of the individual, even though it's not paid. So there's not a cash nexus for everything. Therefore, it's important to save people's time. It's important to reduce the amount of time of commuting to and from work. You are stealing from them if you force them to have to spend more time than necessary in commuting by the way you organize society. That is theft. Maybe if we ask people to be paid by the state for every hour they're compelled to commute as part of their pay schedule, people would realize the importance of this. You look, for example, at society today, latchkey children. You see this stuff. Apart from what the baby boomer problem, the latchkey children phenomenon is increasing. Parents have no time to deal and maintain family life. There is no longer an inner evening dinner hour. If there's sickness in the family, who's going to take care of the kids? You have kids on the street with no social life worth mentioning, often living in fear, especially in poorer neighborhoods, in physical fear of just being alive, wondering where to go to hide from the danger. There's nothing in the family. The parents come home at night, they're grouchy. They're probably working extra jobs or part-time jobs to try to fill in and make an income. The rent is soaring. The cost of power is soaring. Utilities in the house are soaring. The quality of goods are getting poorer and poorer. The shopping malls are getting more and more disgusting and have less to offer of any quality than before. These things are destroying family life, which is an essential part of the social development of the child, is the right to have a family life in which going through childhood and adolescence is buffered by the normal family life, and also a neighborhood life. In former times, the neighborhood would take responsibility, in part, for the children. The neighborhood would take responsibility for helping someone who was ill in the neighborhood. They would just pitch in and help. This was normal in my youth. It was normal even later. People would pitch in and help from among the neighbors. They cared for each other. A child wandering in the street in danger, the neighbors would be concerned. Sometimes they'd be too nosy altogether, but nonetheless they would care. And that's the point. They would care. Today, who cares? It's not my problem. Not my problem. Who cares? And so the lack of caring is an essential part of it, and it's a cost of living. Caring is a cost of living. So that the way we organize is important. Now, how does this affect it? Well, we used to have classical culture. Not very good, but we had it. And in classical culture, what are you doing? When the difference between classical culture and bum stuff that you get today, is that it is of the same nature as, this was beautiful the other day, Megan's Revenge, Sweet Revenge. I richly enjoyed that, and I think she did too. She was getting revenge for all abuses from the past. But the point is just exactly what she did. I mean, it's an illustration of my point where I referred to it. Because the creative aspect, which does not admit of any mechanical formula, of adding a new principal dimension to an undertaking, is the same kind of thing in classical art, in music, or even performing music. Even performing classical composition presents the same problem. Why? Because the question was, as Aaron Smith asked this question, which I belatedly answered, I just got overwhelmed in the rush of things, about the 131 and 132, which I answered yesterday. The 131 or 132, just playing the notes or interpreting the notes doesn't work, or fragmented. You've got to have a unified conception of that composition from beginning to end. A unified conception from the pause before you start to the pause after it ends. And the pauses before and after are an integral part of the music. Because music is not salami. You don't slice it by, piece by piece. It's not composed of slices of salami. Music is composed of a distinction of an object, a unity. And the unity is distinguished, first of all, by a pause before it begins and a pause when it ends. Look, a performer, say a piano performer, good one, will always sit at the keyboard and do nothing. If he goes up and starts playing right away, he doesn't understand music, because he's not thinking about the mind of the audience. He pauses. Why? In order to bring the audience into focus for the transition from the domain of sense perception into the domain of the imagination, where all creative activity occurs. And when the musician has finished the composition, he pauses again, so that the conclusion of the composition does not blend into the response, the visible response by the audience. Therefore, he's facilitating the process by which the imagination occurs. For example, in a classical drama of the classical stage, theater stage, you have the overture. Now, the overture ends before the curtain goes up. Otherwise, the director has made a terrible mistake. The ending of the overture creates a pause. The curtain goes up. And because you're trying to transport the audience quickly from the domain of sense perception, of visual and auditory sense perception, into the domain of the imagination. And the same thing is done in any form of art. There's always something that makes the composition, in a classical composition, a distinct object. Not a collection of parts, not salami, which is sliceable, piece by piece. And the ability to get the audience from the point of looking at the pieces and the sensations to having a sense of this composition as a unity. Now, the 131 is brilliant in one way, as I displayed it. You go from a pause, the performance begins, and it goes through these 7 stages of development. And the performers who know what they're doing will never allow a break in the concentration between the sections. They will always articulate the close of a preceding section such that it goes into and begs going into the beginning of the ensuing section. And therefore, the experience of the mind is with these slight apparent dissonances so introduced, which are built into the composition, the mind is forced to see these stages of transition as themselves a unity. In other words, the transitions become a unity, together with a pause at the beginning and the pause at the end become a unity, so the ideas become a single idea. Just like a scientific discovery, or the exercise of a scientific discovery. You have the problem is not solved until the discovery is completed. Therefore, the discovery of a universal physical principle is a unified idea, because it's a process of development which you cannot slice. You have to go from one to the other of the stages of the process of discovery and experimental testing. Otherwise, you don't get it. So therefore, these things which are characteristic of classical culture, I'll mention one other case. Let's take the case of the easy, visible one. Between archaic Greek art and classical Greek art. Archaic sculpture is against classical sculpture. In archaic sculpture, the intention is to create a figure which is balanced, a tripod principle. It stands 4 square by the force of gravity, does not tilt over. Whereas in classical composition, classical sculpture, the sculpture is by nature off balance. It is never quite a portrait, like a photographic portrait. Never. If you try to paint photographs, you don't understand art. Huh? Because the classical artist always does something else. They create what is actually understandable from the standpoint of the principle of physical least action. They create a distortion such that what you see with the mind, if you reflect on it, is a transition from one condition to another. So what you're seeing is motion, frozen motion, as identified by Keats in the Ode to a Grecian Urn. Motion. This is what the great achievement of Leonardo da Vinci in defining perspective. To put motion into a flat surface by various tricks with color and so forth. Motion. So again, in classical artistic composition or architecture, the same way. Great architecture is based on the same principle as classical sculpture. It's a way it affects the mind. Great architecture should be beautiful in the sense of the mind. It should be classical. It should have a sense of motion in it. Huh? And you see the difference between the classical Greek sculpture and classical Greek architecture and the poor, ponderous, pitiful attempts at imitation by the Romans. Quite a contrast. So this question of culture is extremely important, even though to some people it is only entertainment. It is not entertainment. It's an essential part of the development of the powers of mind. The ability to think creatively depends upon being able to bring the idea of creativity of the same type that we experience in scientific creativity, and to bring it into the dimension of social behavior, of organized social behavior. This conception of man, which is associated with classical art in that form, is essential motivation and conditioning of the human mind to be able to perform in economy. Dull, mean-spirited, stupid people do not make good economies. So we require not only the ability of the individual to be productive in a physical sense of productivity, we require the individual to be situated in a society which government or powers delegated by government provide the basic economic infrastructure which is needed to make individual production efficient. Infrastructure which defines the difference between failure and success of economies in general. But that's not sufficient. Without classical culture, a classical culture which emphasizes man as in the image of the Creator through classical art, and through the use of the stage and painting and sculpture and so forth as media for communicating that to man, you do not have creativity in society. And without creativity in society, you might as well have chipmunks as people. And they're gradually going for nuts. Now, the problem here is, from the standpoint of the bankers and the other parasites, the sophists and other moral degenerates which proliferate in the world still today, is if we develop man so. See, the cynicist does not object to things being better. They don't object to people being more productive. But they do object to a byproduct of things being better and people being more productive. Because if people are more productive, they will not tolerate being reduced to human cattle. And what we have in society today largely are people who have been transformed, even over the past 2 generations, from the conditions of life of people toward the conditions of life of human cattle. First of all, by taking away productivity, scientific productivity. That degrades human life. By ruining the environmental conditions, by making people travel more to commute to work, by denying them better power facilities, by denying them better organization of cities and other areas. They're making people relatively more productive, less productive, and more stupid. But that's their intention. The point is, they recognize, especially with the Renaissance and the American Revolution, they recognize that there was a danger to them of a society such as the United States emerging as a republic, which would provide all kinds of good things, and this they would not deny. Some of them would, but in general they would not deny it. But they would say, yes, you're right, but if you let them have that kind of self-confidence of being citizens in that sense, they will no longer be our cattle. And that we will not tolerate. Therefore, what we will do is we will lower the standard of living. We will frustrate science. We will especially discourage scientific creativity. That's where empiricism came from. You cannot discover. You are limited to your senses. You are only an animal. You don't know anything except what your senses tell you. You're an animal. You're an animal. You're an animal. Don't aspire to anything higher than being an animal. That's what we want you to be. If you behave yourself, and if you don't become excessive in numbers, so we have to cull you, and if you don't become old, so we don't want to feed you anymore, then we'll let you live. will let you think you enjoy yourself, will even let you have entertainment, like cheap free sex on every corner, from whatever you want it from. Huh? We'll let you have that. We may cull you, but we'll let you have that. But don't try to take the power which we reserve to ourselves to decide how society goes. And if you get too smart, you're going to try to run your own society or control who does run your society. And that we will never tolerate. And that's what the issue is. Exactly what the issue is. They say, well, the kind of world we want, the planet we want, will not tolerate a population of 6 billion people. Therefore, we're going to reduce drastically the human population. We'll get it down to less than 1 billion. That is the stated intent of the people behind the present policies. They've said it many times. They've said it very clearly. The Club of Rome, all these guys have said it very clearly. We will not let you have the power you need to sustain a modern society. You can't have nuclear power. We don't mind nuclear power existing if we control it, but you can't have it because it would let you become too powerful, too independent of us. It would let you develop technologies. We don't want you to do that. We want you to rely upon windmills. Huh? We won't let you have classical culture. You'll think. We don't want that. We want you in rave dances, and we'll give you the drugs to enable you to do it. You have George Soros, George Shultz, and others. Legalization of marijuana and other drugs. Why? To make you stupid. Because they want you to be stupid. And people go into drugs. Why? Because they say, look, I don't want to realize I'm stupid. I don't want to think. I can't stand my head. I've got to quiet it down. I've got to dumb me down. I've got to go out rave dancing, which have a similar effect. I'll drop from exhaustion, from ecstasy in wild Dionysic dancing. The cult of Dionysius, which invented drugs and dance, came from the Phrygian cult of Dionysius, which this is modeled upon. So these are the problems of economy. First of all, economy is physical, it is not monetary. To believe in a monetary basis for an economy is the first step toward disaster. What we do with the government is we regulate the economy in such a way that the value, money value of products does not rise above the products themselves as a percentile of income. In other words, the percentile of income required to buy a product must not rise above the money income price of the standard of living. And government must do that. How? By regulating interest rates, by regulating the way in which money is put into circulation, by taxation. You tax things that are higher, which are of less value to society. You put a high tax on financial capital gains which are not invested in a useful way. Exactly the opposite of Kemp Roth, and the direct opposite of today's policy. You tax things less if they are investments in productive values. You may tax them not at all if you think they're sufficiently important to people. In other words, if the people invest in producing something, which is so essential to society, we want it, we may tax it almost at nothing. No tax at all. Whereas things which are undesirable should be taxed. Things which are parasitical should be taxed. If there's a tendency toward inflation, tax it out of existence by taxing the people who are inflating values. Protect the prices of things which are valuable. Force the protection of the prices of production of things that are needed. If you want more farmers, make sure the farmers get a fair price. If you want better farm goods, make sure the farmers get a fair price. If you want investment in a certain industry, make sure a fair price is available in that industry. Investment tax credits, of the Kennedy investment tax credits, just an example of that. So what we do in a sane society is we regulate the flow of money, the issue and flow of money. We regulate interest rates. We regulate trade tariffs. We enter into agreements with other countries on trade in order to protect investments, essential investments of those countries, including our own. So therefore, we regulate the flows of money in such a way that the price of goods, price of money does not rise above the price of goods. As a matter of fact, we do it in such a way that through productivity, the price of goods will drop in terms of money terms relative to the quality of goods produced. We also demand that a tax program which supports the kind of infrastructural investments we require. For public infrastructure, such as power generation and distribution, we will provide, in a sense, what some people call subsidies. We will give favorable treatment in terms of loans, favorable treatment in terms of taxation rates to those. And since we wish to fund the public investment area, that is where the public invests, as we used to, people used to invest their savings, ordinary families would invest their savings for their retirement in public utilities. Public utilities used to be, under Roosevelt and beyond, were regulated. They didn't yield a high interest rate, but they were dependable. People could look forward to retirement or to an emergency knowing that their investment in a bond on a public utility would retain its value, would not be subject to fluctuations on a financial market. We regulated that. So the key thing here is government must regulate. The government must regulate is not a matter of statism versus free enterprise. That's nonsense. 50% of a modern economy at least is in public infrastructure. It costs at least, 50% of the total investment, the total cost of operating an economy is located in basic economic infrastructure. Power, transportation, water management, education, healthcare, so forth and so on. Urban management. And therefore the state must provide that either in the form of direct investment at various levels of government, or it must provide that providing a structure in which private investment is encouraged in public infrastructure, and that area is regulated to make sure it works. And then on top of that, we give incentives, financial incentives in terms of tax, in terms of credit, and so forth, to entrepreneurship, to families who are trying to buy houses or acquire houses and so forth. That is the way the U.S. economy would function when it was following its constitutional intent. And the problem today is we've gone in a different direction. And the problem today is that the people who have taken over, especially since 1963-64, have taken over, are typified by the case of the Southern Strategy of Nixon, which began in 1966 at Biloxi, Mississippi, where he met with the Ku Klux Klan and set up the Southern Strategy, which ran the Republican Party from that point on. And then you had the suburban strategy policy, which was set up by Brzezinski, which was set into motion essentially at the beginning of the 1980s. So both parties are now essentially moving in the direction of fascism as party policy, or have already arrived there in some cases, and we've turned away from those policies. We're now at a crisis where, because we have lost sight of what economy is, and because we now substitute money systems and privately controlled money systems, like independent central banking systems, for government control of its responsibilities, we now have a broken down economy. And the problem is largely in the mind of the citizens who have been brainwashed in various ways into believing in free trade. We do not believe in capitalism. We do not believe in socialism. We believe in the American system. And the American system is the role of government in providing the environment, the total environment, in which the entrepreneurship, both for income, for profit, and other ways of the private citizen, is protected and promoted. Okay, that's it.
Okay, so now we'll take some questions. Our first question comes from the East Coast here. Ali Sharif from Copenhagen. One thing I would point out, because of the precious time we have, to keep the questions concise.
Okay, everybody back there. Everybody back there. Get back. Stretch out. Leave room for our friend here, Mr.
Thank you.
Sharif.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, give him some space.
Too high?
Hi, my name is Ali Sharaf. I'm from the Copenhagen Youth Movement. My question is on the ignorance.
On the what?
Ignorance.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. You have. I was discussing this issue with Paul Rasmussen, whom you know very well. Paul Rasmussen.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I could not understand that you have to educate yourself like for 30, 40, 50 years of your life, and then you realize that you don't know anything. I mean, you know, no, but it sounds somehow ridiculous, you know, that wisdom equals ignorance. I mean, if you reach the level of wisdom, you reach the level of ignorance. So how can you sometimes start a sentence with that I know or they don't know? Which I mean, you can be in a conflict with yourself somehow. That's how I would see it. I mean, you know, I'm sure you would
Okay.
say otherwise. But which actually brings us to the question of opinion. Now, I have heard you and heard a lot of people in the Schiller Institute say that there is no opinions, there is only truth.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, you hear people start a sentence with saying, the way I see it, or I see it this way, or in my point of view, they saying the same thing, that this is my opinion, but trying to avoid they getting attacked by saying this is my opinion, they use another word. Now, yeah, I mean, what should you say?
Well,
And one more question. It's about the question of I or my, which is we saw the Crab Nebula some days ago, which you have 4 pictures of four different pictures of the same object. You know this is a paradox and you have to solve. And this problem is quite new. I mean, it's not very old. Now, if you consider the question of the human being, that you have the question that I say, for example, my body, my soul, my mind, my heart, my hand, whatever I say. But who's talking now? What does these things belong to? I mean, you have, I am all of these and none of these. So.
okay, good. That's perfectly good stuff. And you have 2 ways to go from that: sophistry or knowledge, from just precisely those 2 kinds of questions. Huh? Let's take the Crab Nebula first, just to get it out of the way. Now, the Crab Nebula was not fully covered in the presentation as to its antiquity. You say the antiquity of this knowledge. No, the Crab Nebula was first discovered, in effect, by the Chinese a long time ago. They discovered what they observed was a supernova. So we know the Crab Nebula originated in a supernova. Then in the 1980s, we had a friend of ours who was a leading German scientist in the nuclear field, Professor Baga, and he pointed out to me in a conversation, he said that the Crab Nebula is known to be the primary source of gamma ray radiation impacting the Earth in a certain cycle. That is, when the Earth a part of the Earth is aimed in the direction of the Crab Nebula in the proper way. This is the highest concentration of what we call cosmic rays hitting the Earth. And near Denmark, in a phased array, which was built up there for observing they determined this, and they compared that with a much smaller and older site in England, which recorded in their records the same thing. So here we had two things we knew about the Crab Nebula. Then, we also knew from my investigations then on various sources and whatnot, that the Crab Nebula had some very anomalous time features. And as Sky was emphasizing in this direction, that the rate at which certain effects occur, which Sky touched upon in his report, the rate at which certain changes occur, which are non-uniform changes, occur in the Crab Nebula, is actually indicates beyond the speed of light. So therefore, there cannot be a causal relationship from the interior of the action to the cause of the action overall. This is analogous to the case of Kepler's discovery of gravitation, in which the case of the so-called non-uniformity of the trajectory of the planet in its orbit indicates that there could be no action at a distance explanation for this kind of behavior. And therefore, this indicated the existence of something outside observation. Outside the observation, in this case, in the case of the Crab Nebula, of the speed of light. So therefore, there's an effect operating in the universe which is faster than the speed of light. Just as gravitation is faster than the rate of change of action which can be attributed to a uniform action. Whenever you find a phenomenon like that, you know, you see why I come into this first, you know that you're dealing with a universal principle. How do you know? You know because you had a scientific training in that direction, so that you're now able, by aid of what we do with the study of the complex domain, which is, I propose this as the core of the educational program of the youth movement, precisely because it's the simplest and most efficient thing I know to demonstrate what I mean by the word I know, the verb I know. So that's the key to it. Now, I or my, well, that's a very interesting concept. What's your identity? See, the question of I involves, can you prove you are a you? That you're not just a continuation of some blob floating in the universe. That you are a distinct individuality in the universe. That you have an actual existence as an individuality in the universe. This is the same problem as Helge was referring to with the Herbartian thing, which Riemann referred to, and Geistesmasse. How do you know the existence of principles which are outside the capacity of sense perception, which are efficient? You know they're efficient, like gravity is efficient. You can't see it, you can't taste it, you can't eat it, but it works. And you can use the effects of gravity, something you can't see, something you can't touch, but you can control the effects by using it, and any other physical principle. So therefore, you know this thing exists, and it has an objective value, just like a musical composition we were discussing earlier. This question about the pause before the beginning and at the end of a musical composition to get it across. It has an identity. Now you, in a sense, have an identity. You can know that identity with the aid of this exercise which the complex domain defines. Right? The existence of something objective, which you define in terms of the complex domain, outside the scan of sense perception, which is not a blah, but it's something very definite. And you can define yourself also as something very definite. Therefore, you can say that, meaning something definite, and you can say I, meaning yourself, that you are something definite, because discovery only occurs inside the individual human mind. It does not occur as a joint interaction among human minds. It may be a product of interaction, but it occurs within the individual mind. If one fellow says, I see it, the other fellow says, I don't see it. They've both gone through the same process. I see it. If he does see it, he sees it. The point, that is the principle. The other has not yet seen the principle. So the product of the discussion is all have participated in the discussion, the dialogue. One person or some people have seen it as individuals. Others have not. So the discovery does not lie in the collective group. The process of discovery lies there, but the actual act of discovery lies in the individual mind. And then the demonstration of the validity of the principle as experimentally then establishes that it is a principle, in fact. You know it, you discovered it, it's me, it's mine. The same thing is true in acting, great acting. This requirement of a great actor, or even a good professional actor, is to make the part they perform their own. Now, for example, if you're performing Shakespeare, you're not reading the text, presumably. That's not acting. That's not good acting. If you're performing the part of Hamlet, you must own Hamlet. You must own that character. You must be able to speak as if it were that character. You must communicate what that character thinks, how he feels, these kinds of things. You own the part. You can act the part on stage. You can convey to the audience the existence of a definite personality, not a blah that you compose of random sentences and so forth. So you know. This ability to know is the truth. Now, granted, you have a society which is a sophistical society. This is a society of sophistry, where, to use a euphemism, everybody bullshits. And therefore they use to say, well, I know. When they say that, you say, okay, get the manure fork out. They're talking again. Because they don't know anything. They say, I know, but they don't know anything. That's their problem. And if we worry about their knowing, that's our problem. Our point is without actually killing them or anything, is to bring them to a state of knowledge from a state of mere opinion. They are just merely expressing an opinion. And most opinion is nonsense, especially these days. So how do you get to a state of knowledge? It's simply, first of all, a scientific question. Can you make it work? If you know, can you make it work? If you know, how can you show somebody else how to discover it? How can you prove it to someone else? Knowledge is truth. Same thing. And as you complain, when one uses the term I know as a substitute for merely, well, I think somebody told me this. I feel this. And the other thing you didn't throw in, which you could have used, is I feel. Someone says, well, the economy is collapsing. Well, you might be right, but I feel that's not the case. I feel that Bush is a good president, no matter what you say. I feel. Huh? And with these guys who feel, keep away from them in crowded rooms. So that the point is, it's the I feel conception. I have desire, a wish to say that I believe. I wish to posture. I wish to pretend that I know. So I don't say I know. I don't say I pretend to know. I say I know. You don't know a damn thing. They only feel, and keep away from them in crowded rooms.
I have a short announcement here. We need to take a 5-minute session here to move the piano out of the room right now, where the piano movers are here. So if everyone could stay in their places, we'll resume in about 5 minutes, or perhaps less, we hope.
Got a moving experience here.
That's right. Thank you very much.
Good.
Next on the list, I don't know where he went. Well, we were going to do two, but yeah, West Coast, if you have somebody who wants to ask a question, go ahead.
Okay, first up is Ramon Meza, and then Anna Shaven. Anna, you should go first.
Okay. Okay. Hi, I'm going to butt in front of him really quick because he's going to get his stuff. Hello. I have two questions, and I'll go through them kind of quickly, I guess, for time. But one thing is, we had this panel last night, and there were a couple people who went through Gauss and and different curvatures, and it was interesting, and it actually, I thought, poked a good question that I wanted to pose to you, which is something that I've been trying to reconcile, but also there's been discussion here on how to actually incorporate the newer members into the beyond psychoanalysis discussions that older members have had pretty in-depth. And what you said on this recently was that the Gauss and the paper, the 1799 paper, is what you wanted to use to actually to deal with this question in people. And I got a real sense of it last night, because the question was posed to the two presenters, you know, how did your identity change as you worked through this kind of universal principle or a scientific principle? And I just got a real sense of it about what you were talking about. And I was wondering if we could pose the same question to you personally on how your identity actually changed when you first encountered, I don't know if it was Gauss or Riemann, but actually working through this type of principle. And then the other question is, and I don't want to sound like Johnny One Note, because I know I ask about this a lot, but you brought up recently, I guess, that you wanted to do some work on the ancient Greeks and some investigation into what their discoveries were and just more on what they were working on. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts or on how they were actually investigating space, because it seems to me that they would have understood this principle of bel canto, or of singing, as well as the Platonic solids and all these different ideas of how space is ordered. So I was just wondering if you could comment on that, or how we would actually investigate this more into this, or if any work's being done on it, or what you think. You know, did Plato know bel canto, or something to that effect? Okay, thanks.
Well, it's a good two in reverse on this one, because there's a shorter answer. Just take what we did, which you were involved in, on this. Well, we got Jenny in this question about the reenactment of what had been a description of Pythagoras' definition of the comma. Huh? Pythagoras had defined that. How? Apparently it was only a description. We don't have his actual writing. We have a description from some of his students on the definition of the comma. And I said, okay, we can demonstrate that. We can demonstrate that by bel canto. And all you have to do is recognize what Florentine bel canto is, which we've gone through a number of things, including the music manual, what that means. Is simply the natural way in which the human voice is physically disposed to function at greatest efficiency. That's all there is to it. It is the question of placement, a very simple question. The key to bel canto is placement. And once you can place your voice in the right place in the mask, then you can achieve bel canto by exercising and rehearsing and practicing it. But it's natural to human beings. All poetry is based actually on bel canto. Once you understand bel canto and understand the way in which different languages adapt themselves to it, it's like the difference between German and Italian, for example, and bel canto is a good common purpose. English is more difficult in some respects. But poetry, all poetry, is based on musicality, on bel canto. So that wherever you find poetry, you can adduce bel canto from the poetry, if you know the language. I had this thing with Professor Dandekar in India, and when I was curious about how some of these, on the Talak proposition, how could there be poems in the ancient Vedic which date from between 6,000 and 4,000 BC, which are replicated today in Sanskrit, poetry which replicates with a high degree of precision an astronomical determination of the existence of the cycle, equinoctial cycle. And there are other similar kinds of effects in this poetry. Now, how could someone, by simply chanting poetry over thousands of years of successive generations, without the aid in most of the period of a written language, how could they record this with fidelity? Now, anybody who's learned to sing properly, and sings not from a score but sings from memory, knows exactly how that works. How do you put across classical song and perform it so that you have the ending of it in your mind at the beginning, and it controls you from the beginning? It's because there's a mechanism of the mind which corresponds to a physical characteristic of the physiology of the body, which gives you this bel canto effect, which she demonstrated. I mean, remember the thing with the monochord and so forth? You get contradictions, paradoxes. Now, the fact that you can demonstrate the existence of what this report of Pythagoras described means that we know what he thought. Because we take this concept, that they report he said this. Well, did he say it? Is that a fair description of what he said? Well, let's test it. Let's see if it works. If it works, it's a true discovery, a principle. So therefore, on the question of space in general, no, I just went with this thing with spherics. They describe spherics. They make clear what spherics is. Now you go back to, they tell you, or the reports of Pythagoras' work tell you that this came from Egypt. So you go to about 2700, 2750 BC, and you go to the Great Pyramids. Do the Great Pyramids contain a cycle, a calendar cycle within them, which goes back tens of thousands of years? It does, with accuracy. So therefore, we know that the conception of space, time, and so forth existed in the concept of spherics in ancient times and to the Greeks. And it occurs, the other thing we know is this: we are humbled by this knowledge. We are humbled when we realize that within the span of extended European civilization, which begins approximately 600 BC or 700 BC, the time of Thales and Solon and Pythagoras and so forth, that during that period there was an amazing amount of knowledge which was lost to many parts of European civilization later, which had to be recreated and rediscovered. We find that when you look at discoveries, such as some of the work we did with Brunelleschi, for example, on the question of the dome, and I fretted with that thing and recognized that the dome, the cupola of the Cathedral of Florence, could only have been constructed on the basis of a catenary principle of construction. And I had my friend, the professor, who was the engineer who had been working on that for years, confirmed that that's exactly what happened. But then you think about the catenary principle. The catenary principle was first defined in modern mathematics, after that, as modern mathematical physics, by Leibniz, with the aid of Bernoulli, Jean Bernoulli, as being the basis for the universal physical principle of least action. So that actually you see now that Brunelleschi was using the universal principle of physical least action before it was actually discovered, apparently, in a sense, in the form that was discovered by Leibniz. So therefore we recognize that mankind is rather primitive, because we keep losing scientific knowledge which earlier civilizations had, and we lose it because cultures are destroyed by relative dark ages. Like the Roman civilization was a dark age of humanity. The medieval period was a dark age of humanity. The 16th to 17th century were predominantly a period of religious wars, of a dark age in humanity. Huh? And we keep coming back to rediscover things we've lost. What we're doing, actually, we as an organization are doing and have been doing, we are, in a sense, find ourselves modestly rediscovering great principles which are lost to modern universities in general, but which were known to people before us. We study certain works and realize both that the principle, and we also recognize then that people before us knew it, but it was lost because of a cultural decadence in the meantime. So that's the nature of the thing. Yes. Did they have a basic conception? Yes. Did they have a weakness in it? Yes. The weakness is obvious. The idea of universality, of physical universality, existed with ancient man, Greece, and so forth. But the idea of the universality of humanity did not really exist as a practical conception. It was only with the Renaissance, when the idea of that the state can no longer obey the laws passed down by some religious authority from top, a priori, or something else, but the state must obey a provable universal law in terms of its applicability to all of the people of society. That the state is illegitimate unless it serves the general welfare of all of the people. Now, this idea was impossible as a general idea under conditions in which people lived as human cattle. And prior to the Renaissance, in principle, despite ancient Greece, despite Christianity, mankind lived mostly as human cattle, either hunted cattle, as by the Spanish conquistadores, or as herded cattle. As today, most people in the United States are herded cattle. Our struggle is to liberate the people of the United States from their status as herded cattle. They think like herded cattle. A rave dance is an exhibition of people who believe they're human cattle. Otherwise, they wouldn't do such a foolish thing. Probably bad for your back, too. Bad for your spinal cord, among other things. Who knows what will come out of that? All right, so that's, yes, do these kinds of ideas, does this conception of space and time, these kinds of ideas exist with ancient Greeks? Yes. The difference is, in modern times, as opposed to the constructive geometry, which is a pre-Euclidean Greek geometry, in modern times the difference is that we have mathematical physics developed. Once it was recognized as a matter of practice that the state, that society existed for all of the people within it. And therefore, science had to be those laws of nature, those laws which were relevant to the benefit of all of the present and coming generations of a society. And therefore, we took from the stars, the sense of universe, we took the idea of universality, and we brought it down to earth and said there's a universality of humanity, of people, in which people as a species cannot be called human cattle, nor governed as if they were human cattle. That's the difference. On the question of psychoanalysis beyond, you have it essentially. What I had to deal with back in the early 1970s was the fact is that in that period you had the epidemic of Sigmund Freud, or something like that. Everybody was into psychoanalysis, whether they needed it or not. They were all going to the psychoanalyst. They didn't feel they had achieved social status unless they virtually owned a psychoanalyst, or unless the psychoanalyst owned them. So in that period, you had all these people on campus, and they were all concerned about their sex life. And it got kind of wild toward the middle and end of the 1960s into the 70s. It produced an Arnie Schwarzenegger, I think, or something like that. He had sex beyond life, or sex after life, or something like that, which is probably his deepest devout wish. So at that point, it was necessary, I undertook this as beyond psychoanalysis, particularly because I had to deal with a practical problem that our organization faced and people they dealt with faced. They were all into psychoanalysis in one degree or another. And I had to free them of the plague in the same way that Megan tried to free people from the obsession of Rameau the other day. You want to free people from Rameau, you have to take him on. If you want to free people from psychoanalysis, you have to take it on. And I said beyond psychoanalysis, not to teach psychoanalysis that was necessary to go into what it is, but rather to teach people to escape from it. That was the point. Now the problem is different. All the people who were into psychoanalysis are baby boomers, and of course they have gone someplace. Not physically, but they've gone someplace mentally. They're not in the real world. I have a different problem now. You are the generation, with no future generation. You were abandoned, in a sense, psychologically, by your parents' generation. Maybe not every parent, but by the parent generation as a whole, by the culture. So therefore, you have a different problem. It's the same problem, but a different one, a different form. It's how, since the culture has broken down, since the transmission of a viable culture has broken down, you no longer can rely upon your parents' generation for the transmission of culture. You have to go back to an old geezer like me to get some transmission of culture, because we knew something at least, and we tried to transmit it. We had a lot of problems in trying to do so, but we did try, some of us at least. Your problem is you have no transition, you have no cultural process. Your parents' generation, as a generation, has cut itself off. They've gone into a dead-end pleasure society, not a future-oriented society. And therefore, you're stuck in a situation where you say, what am I? You take the suicide rate among young people, among adolescents and going even beyond adolescence. Why? Why is suicide? I cannot stand thinking I'm nothing. I want to end the feeling of being nothing. Dangerous, deadly. But that's only a symptom of the problem. The problem is, who am I and what is truth? Because if I want to know who I am, I have to know if what I believe I am is truthful. Is it an illusion? It haunts me. Therefore, what I had to address was the question of how could young people who perceive themselves cast into a generation which had no future, cast into that generation by society around them, their parents' generation, how could they define truth? They couldn't define it by a kind of tradition which would be passed on from generation to generation in previous generations. They had to take it as from the start. And how do you do it from the start? You start from the simple relationship of man to nature, physical science. And you take the fundamental principle of modern mathematical physics, which is expressed by Gauss in two levels. First of all, in respect to modern mathematical physics as such, but also by reference to a pre-Euclidean constructive geometry, in which the same questions had been raised thousands of years earlier. And therefore, that was the difference. It's the same principle. The principle is, what is the difference between man and a beast? And then, with beyond psychoanalysis, I had to say, it's creativity. It is those passions and emotions associated with creativity which are valid. Others are not valid. They're bestial. So those emotions which are associated with creativity are truth, are beauty. Same thing. The same thing is true for you. So you start with the question of a simple demonstration, the simplest aspect of life, of human life. Simple creativity in understanding universal physical principles. What is a universal physical principle? Then go on beyond that. Now look at the social relations, such as classical artistic composition, as a higher expression of the same issue of truth. Huh? And now you have a sense of what truth is. And there you can go from there to now look at earlier generations of culture with the assurance that now you know what you mean by truth, both from the standpoint of physical truth in the ordinary sense of physics, and also truth in the sense of classical artistic composition. And once you have that conception of truth, now you can look at all human history, because you have a mooring place in knowledge, a vantage point, a pinnacle on the mountain from which you can look down at all history and make it make sense to you then, or will make sense to you with a certain amount of effort.
Okay, we'll take 2 questions from the East Coast. Randy Kim? No. Oh, there was one more? Oh, right, okay.
They disappeared, what do they do?
Yeah.
They vanished?
Well, we can take another one from the West Coast. Sorry about that.
Mr. LaRouche, since coming to your conference, a lot of my notions about God and my spiritual thoughts have been challenged and left me a bit perplexed. My question to you is, actually there are 2 of them. Is God bound within the bounds of that which he has created? And secondly, is one self-aware after death?
Well, two answers then. Now, God is coextensive with the universe. It's a personality coextensive with the universe, which I've dealt with a number of times. The question of, if we know that creativity is an activity peculiar to the individual mind, and if we know that this same creativity is the characteristic of the universe, then we know who God is and where he is. Secondly, why do you assume that the extent of mortal existence is the extent of you? Why do you confine yourself to a place in time? Think particularly about Archimedes. Think about Aristophanes, his correspondent and contemporary, and their great discoveries. Now today, and I encourage anyone to do so, is to relive especially the work of Aristophanes, his discoveries, which are remarkable, one of the greatest minds of his time and the greatest minds of all we know in all history, a follower of Plato. Archimedes, his correspondent. Now you today, because we have all these records of Archimedes' writings and less of Aristophanes, because of the burning of the Library of Alexandria, we have less in that case. But we have this. You today can experience in your mind a personal relationship to Archimedes by reliving his problems and experiments and by the results he achieves. The same is true of any person whose work you relive in great classical art, in physical science. Right? So therefore you relive that. Now, as I've emphasized in reference to the St. Matthew Passion as a pedagogical paradigm, the objective in an adequate performance of the St. Matthew Passion, which is done with the congregation, takes some time. It's not exactly short. It does take some time. The audience and the performers are living through it. If the thing is well done, and if you don't have any crazy falsetto voices stuck in case of the indicated singers for some kind of sexual or asexual spice, then the audience relives the passion and crucifixion of Christ. They pass over from space and time, the confinement of the space and time in which they're sitting, to a reenactment of events which occurred up to 2,000 years before. They relive the experience. They relive it in the imagination, but that is not a defect. It is the sensual aspect of reality which is merely the shadow. The search for wisdom is a search for the substance which casts the shadow upon our sense perceptions. And therefore, when the imagination is approached in a certain way to the re-experiencing of real events, we relive those events. We live as if at that moment when the events occurred. We experience that event as it occurred. And the object of the great artists, such as Bach, is to produce that effect of the audience reliving the experience of that place and time. And especially re-experiencing the meaning of that place and time, not as a physical event, but as something higher, a mental event. So therefore, the concept, particularly in Christian theology, is the concept of the simultaneity of eternity. And it has some very interesting physical implications. What is time? Now, the concept of time in society today is actually an idiotic one. It's Cartesian. It's a sensual sense that time and space are extended in three directions infinitely in an open, flat space, and that time is extended backwards and forwards at a uniform rate. But that's not true. It's physically not true. There is no such thing as a Cartesian space. It's a fantasy. It doesn't exist. But most people rely upon interpreting events and physical events on the terms of Cartesian space, which doesn't exist. Riemannian space does exist. But in Riemannian space, in reality, time is not constant in a linear sense. From the best thing we know is that time speeds up as the universe develops. It speeds up. When we make a physical discovery and apply it, time speeds up. For example, a very crude illustration of the point. If I build a high-speed transportation system, right, instead of highways or mud roads or something like that, then do I speed up society? Yes, every action in society which is useful is speeded up. It occurs more rapidly. When I increase the power of a process, I speed up the process. The same result occurs, but I speed it up. The general relationship is that, and we had this also in the pedagogical, which is done the night before last, is the universe is probably speeding up. And is exemplified by the speed of action of non-living as compared to living, as compared to human mental life. The intervention of man, as was emphasized in the pedagogical, the impact of man, and from a Vanadsky standpoint, on nature is greater than the impact of life. That is, the changes that are induced by mental life, by man, are faster than the changes introduced on Earth by biological processes. And biological processes transform the Earth more rapidly than non-living processes. So that when we're dealing with the reality of phase space, time is merely a physical characteristic of action. We experience it as a sequence. We experience movement in space as a sequence. But in the end, we know that the universe has a different way of organizing itself. And what we see is the shadows. We also know that in sense of our own life, where a person is willing to give up their life, and again this goes back to the question of the St. Matthew Passion. Christ surrenders his life, his mortal life, for mankind. As Jeanne d'Arc surrenders her life for mankind as well as for France. The sublime, which we prize the most, the highest motive for the best behavior by human beings is the sublime. Not that people seek to die prematurely. Right, quite the contrary. You seek to live as long as possible, as long as you're doing good work. You want the work to proceed. And sometimes it's harder for people to pick up where you left off than it is for you to continue. So you struggle to live on. But you will never sacrifice the purpose of your life for the sake of securing your immortality, or securing your mortality. Never. And so therefore, this is the lesson of Christ. And the lesson of Christ, the lesson of the sublime in Christ, is the lesson which is transmitted by the St. Matthew Passion. Devote your life, expend your life wisely. It's the only thing you have. Spend it wisely. It's finite. It's not infinite. Spend it wisely. Spend it for a purpose you will need not be ashamed of if somebody comes looking at you after you're dead. Spend it in such a way that you benefit humanity, contemporary and that which comes after you. And then laugh at death. Not that you want it, but laugh at it. It cannot conquer you if you're living in that way. And that much, in answer to your question, is certain. Beyond that, I don't know everything, but I know that much.
Okay, Randy?
Hello, Lynn. I've been looking recently at Chinese civilization, and I sort of realized, looking at it, how ignorant one can be if you don't have a richness of history, because some of the most simple discoveries, looking at some of the works of this Neo-Confucian, his name was Zhu Xi, I believe, and reading what he wrote about Li, or what translates into principle, I couldn't help but thinking about, the last dialogue that Socrates had before he was killed, and Leibniz's conception of the monad, and also you and Riemann's conception of thought objects and such. Now, the question I was having was, earlier in the conference, I was having a discussion about the purpose of life, and how can you prove that there's actually a purpose, and how can you prove what that purpose is? So I was thinking, these universal ideas about the monad, Li, thought object, they're not physical, so how can we go about talking about the purpose of life and, not get lost looking at pictures of Jesus or, watching movies of Jeanne d'Arc, but actually getting to the metaphysical idea of it?
Exactly it. And this has been one of the great mysteries in terms of the legacy of Chinese culture, is especially this concept of Li, which is one of the most fascinating aspects of the entire culture, which of course I think is actually earlier than Xi. But we've had quite some discussion of it, especially Helga's been looking at it in our work with people in China, is the question of the ecumenical conception of what are the points in the history of China, development of its culture, which are the points of intersection, or deep intersection, shall we say, with China's culture, which we would wish to make today from the standpoint of a European standpoint. It's extremely important. The essential thing is, of course, is this, which is I emphasize in the complex domain issue, is the issue is to understand the distinction between the shadow of reality, which is sense certainty, and the reality, which is defined in terms of universal principles, physical principles, for example. And therefore, the issue here, the same thing comes up as you say Socrates. Yes, exactly. The question of the apology of Socrates, for example, raises this question. The decisions made by Socrates, as reported by Plato in those dialogues, the same question. What is the truth about life? For what do you spend life? What is life for? How do you use it? That is mortal life. Well, that's the big question. And obviously, China is a very old culture, because you have, look at Asia, you look at South Asia and Southeast Asia and some of the coastal areas of China, southern China, those areas which were less inundated by the Ice Age, 200,000 year approximately Ice Age, preceding the modern, preceding what we call ancient history today. And obviously, as we see, there were pulsations in the evolution of China's culture from which certain influences such as the Confucian legacy emerge. We find in India, we find a similar kind of phenomenon, very ancient culture. We find in Egypt, which again is in the same situation. You find this astronomy, which takes you way back, an astronomy which is embedded as a characteristic feature of the Great Pyramid construction, for example. So this reality, I think, as I have located it, look at the complex domain, understand what that means in terms of reality, and the problem comes up, which I'm getting questions here today to that effect. If that is true, how do I, in effect, locate sensually the meaning of my personal life? If I accept that that's true, that the reality of the universe lies outside sense perception, that sense perception is merely the shadow, the adumbration of reality upon our sense organs, and if truth lies not in our mortal sensual existence as such, but in the effect our existence has as a knowing being and an acting being in the universe, this produces a certain quivering of anxiety, uncertainty in the mind of the individual. And there's no simple way to deal with that. It's easy for me. I'm very experienced with it. I've had a lot of experience with this gentleman called death. So I know about this. But for younger people, yes, it is a struggle. Is it a cause for anxiety? No. It's good. To have the struggle forces you to be honest, not to fake it, not to presume you have an answer you don't have. Recognize this exists, value great art for the light it casts on these questions, and look at the uncertainty as paradoxical, and your attempt to conquer the uncertainty with knowledge as being a certainty. There's a sense that you're doing, you say, well, I don't know what the final truth is. And I'm sure that most of you feel that way. You don't know what the final answer is on a lot of things. But the fact that you're committed to conquering those issues which are either important to you because of what you're up against in particular, or because you think it's important to society, on the other hand, the fact that you're so engaged is itself a quality of certainty. Well, that you are contributing to mankind gives you a rightful, immediate sense of identity. That is certain. And the uncertainty is simply a goad which drives you and drives you and drives you to answer questions you have not been able to answer before, or questions you never thought of before.
Ed Hamler? Is he in here? Okay.
Hi, Lynn. Ed from Philly. Now, the question I'm going to ask is actually coming from some work I've been doing on you, actually. Of course, the complex domain paper, #1, but then I went back to some of the older papers on LaRouche's discovery, and then the truth about temporal eternity. Now, what I've been dealing with is this question of discovery as discovery. I actually made a big breakthrough when I was doing work in Detroit on this synarchism question, because it was very difficult for me to understand what it actually was in the beginning until this the tragic event with Professor Bondarevsky happened. Now, when that actually happened, it became clear to me what this actually was, and the type of process that took place is what you were just finishing talking about, which was I was immediately transported to temporal eternity. And I wasn't dealing with a matter of trying to get rid of crooked politicians, but I was actually in a battle with Napoleon himself. And it became very real to me. I mean, even now, that's the fight. The fight isn't, you know, these white guys with comb-overs and, you know, Halliburton and these types of things. It's this historical battle, and it's real to me. Now, and you know, with that, there's a certain type of passion, right? You get excited. You say, okay, now I have it. Now the problem comes in, you know, how do you actually convey that to someone else? Because you want to have people know what we're doing. I mean, if we're fighting against Napoleon, you tell somebody on the street that, and they walk by, you say, how come they didn't get it? I say we're fighting against Hitler. They say, I know. Bye. What's that? So what happened was, in my discussions with a couple of my roommates, was that what happens is that when you try to explain something to someone, the discovery becomes dead. Whereas when you discovered it, it was alive. It's like what Nick said. You're selling a dead corpse when you try to explain things and describe them like the empiricist. But that's what's happened. Now, my hypothesis in dealing with this problem would be looking at the three hypotheses. Hypothesis, high hypothesis, and hypothesizing a high hypothesis. If I can understand this and make that my thought object, just like temporal eternity is now my thought object, if I can really grasp that as a one, then I think that I can deal with especially this issue of being creative all the time and pedagogical all the time. Not pedagogy as a Riemann for anti-dummies that we read through, and I know what the square root of -1 is now. But being pedagogical in the sense of being able to transport someone to temporal eternity. So can you please elaborate on this process for me?
Okay. It's fun. Now, what you should think of when you deal with this kind of question, you should think of great classical drama as a model. And sometimes great poetry, classical poetry will do it for you too. What you do is obviously, the first thing you have to do in art, and always think of classical art when you're thinking about communication, about social matters. Same thing in physical, but it's different. But in social matters in particular. Now, the form for approaching social processes is classical drama, especially classical tragedy. And if you look at the dialogues of Plato as in that form of drama, then you have the key to it. Now, so therefore, when you want to present an idea, the first thing you have to do is get the subject's attention. In other words, you want to say what you want to get to, but you've got to get their attention, number one, and number two, you've got to create a problem in their mind which they accept as a tantalizing problem. That's exactly what all great dramatists do. You create a problem, you create a character, they look at this character, they have a limited interest in that character. He's coming on stage, they say, what is this all about? Now you introduce a problem on stage, and as a spectator, you're drawn into, in your imagination, into wondering how this problem could be resolved, how it arose, how it could be resolved. Now you've got their attention. Now the next thing you've got to do is you've got to play that like a musical composition or a great tragedy so that you lead people through a obsession, in a sense, with finding the answer to the question you've posed. And that's how it's done. Failure, we've often had this discussion with people about great people who are great musicians in the sense of their training and understanding, but who cannot perform effectively even though they're well trained at their instrument, because they don't capture the attention of the audience at the first instant. They somehow fail to do that. They have to get into the piece before they get into it. They don't have a sense of, they don't convey a sense of the composition as a whole or the implication of the composition as a whole when they start the performance. The first thing is to get attention. That's what the pause is to do in any performance of a classical work. You've got to get the attention. You've got to create the problem for the imagination. So you get the attention. You have to create an element of surprise. Then you create another element of surprise. Now you got it. Go from there. And stick with that element of surprise. That tension is the thing that you're going to stick to throughout the entire performance, up to the end. You got their attention. So the trick in this thing is actually to experiment. For example, let's take the case, we've been talking about Don Quixote a great deal. Dr. Carlos Wesley had written this piece. There were other things because of the importance for Hispanic American culture. And Don Quixote is one of the most important items historically for understanding Spanish culture and other things. You've got to start with Don Quixote. Right? And you've got to understand it as it was designed to be read in short chapters by people, by rather ordinary people, and to be understood by rather ordinary people, to get across to these people a sense of things. And all great composition, Rabelais in French, which is a predecessor actually of Cervantes in this art, does the same thing with his series, same kind of thing. All great classical drama does that. Take, for example, Christopher Marlowe's Mephistopheles, Dr. Faust, Dr. Faustus. You have the same kind of thing. It captures the great drama, always captures the imagination. And you have parables and things like that which do the same thing. So well, the first thing to do in conveying ideas is to think about this problem. And the best way to think about the problem is to rehearse the problem by looking at classical artistic compositions, dramas, and so forth from that standpoint. It's a method. One of the reasons why it's important for people to study classical drama and to try to participate in little pieces, at least, of performing of classical drama is to get into the feeling of how do you put that across. When you're dealing with classical drama, you know you're dealing with a reliable material in terms of the type of material to deal with. And what you want to do is you want to create that, in a sense, on the street or wherever. You want to transplant this knowledge you get from living through how the greatest artists have approached this problem in classical drama, and you want to apply that to the street or something else or some other situation. So you think about, before you speak, you do that. Now there's another aspect to this thing, which I know from hearing you speak. I haven't really talked to you before your question, but from you hearing you speak, I know exactly, in a sense, what's going on in your mind and what your capabilities are. You can do that. I have no doubt you can do that. It's just a matter of practice, and my best thing is approach to that is look at classical drama, think about setting up, composing a little drama, or something what Cervantes does in Don Quixote, in many of these little stories, or what is done by Rabelais. And think about what your problem that you described from that standpoint. How can you, rather than just throwing something at somebody, provoke them, provoke their interest? They said something, or they reacted. What's your comeback? Now the comeback is not a smart response in the sense of being smart aleck. It's a provocation to shift the focus. Like, you know, this was used in where somebody quoted my thing about feed the cat, right? The other night, the same thing. That's how you do it. And I often do that myself because that's the way to get attention. To get the focus shifted from the ordinary reaction into a sense that there's a different dimension here than they've been thinking about. And when people accept the fact that you have challenged the validity of their interpretation of something they thought they knew all about. What was that you said? Then you got them. And if you know your stuff, you're on your own. And I find that our people organizing generally tend to do a fairly good job when they're in that state of mind. Now, what we use is also as a stunt, as you know, and they started in California. And I recommended this. I said, well, if you're going to go on a street deployment, don't go out with 1 or 2 people. What you do is you can take over a whole area if you deploy a group of people in the right way. Because what happens is the guy is reacting to as he passes by. He reacts to the first one. The second one is now waiting for him and knows what they're up against. The third guy is going to pick up on the story. The fifth guy, this guy's lost the case. You know? Because our people, in the process, in this dramatic sequence, which they're creating on the street, it's a drama. A guy's walking down the street, just an innocent guy, walking down the street. He's minding his own business. Some guy says this to him. He says, another guy says, another guy says, what are you doing to me? And so I think just, I mean, I know a lot of you are working with this, doing these reenactments of classical dramas, sections of them, doing Platonic dialogues, things like that. All of these things should be looked at as grist for the mill, rehearsing as these are intended to do, to rehearse you for coping with real life, to rehearse you for intervening in large populations in this, exactly the way that the greatest artists who composed these dramas as poetry and so forth intended, or like Cervantes. There's no better way to organize in the Spanish language than Cervantes. Don Quixote has about everything you could need for almost any situation arising in the Spanish language. There's at least some story which will give you a hint is how danger to us and we to them. And that, all right, now first of all, as I've said in the course of things at the conference, the great fakery which affects people when you mention the word economics is money. They try to explain a system of money which is a sound system, they argue, for running an economy. And as I said, a system of money is insane, intrinsically, because it's only paper, it's arbitrary, it has no physical content. Did you ever see money plow a field? Did you ever see a coin talking? If you did, you should talk to about that. All right, so therefore, money has no intrinsic value, nor does gold have an intrinsic value as a currency. These things have determined values by the processes in which they function. Money is merely a medium of exchange. It is necessary because society is composed of tightly integrated and complex social relations. And therefore, in order to process the exchange of goods and other things, you need money as a measure of the social political process of exchange. Money properly is created only by a government, not by anybody else. One of the great evils we have to contend with is money being created by private interests who then sell money on the market for a price, such as central banking systems or private family-style merchant banks, which create currency and demand a monopoly among themselves, among the bankers, of a control over a currency. This is where the problem arises. Because then when this group gets control over the value of money, the power to determine its value by interest rates, yields, and so forth, essentially economy starts with purely physical values in the sense of the physical values dependent upon man's ability to discover universal physical principles and to derive and apply technologies obtained through these discoveries. That is real economics. Now this economics has two essential features. One, which we already discussed in the process of the conference repeatedly. On the one side, we have what we call universal physical principles per se. These are discoveries of principles which an individual mind makes. Maybe many individual minds make them, but they each make them individually. You don't learn, you don't have a creative process in which somebody makes a discovery and then gets out and describes the discovery to others, and that is not actually transmitting the discovery. That is, the people who receive this instruction, this learning, do not really know what they're talking about. Only the person who creates the idea or who recreates the discovery of the idea actually knows what he or she is talking about. Only he or she is qualified to understand how to apply what is described to those who merely learn. And therefore, it's the participation of people in reenacting discoveries from the past and applying them socially, which is the source of the increase of wealth. And therefore, without that process, which includes the process of education, maturation, family relations, and so forth, classical artistic forms of productions, all these things go together to enable human beings to make discoveries of principle, to reenact those discoveries, to apply those principles to practice, and to know how to use tools which are relevant to these kinds of discoveries. And that's how wealth is produced, essentially, from the standpoint of the individual. When we're talking about the individual entrepreneur who runs a small firm, his primary function is as a mediation of these kinds of discoveries or their technologies derived from them. He's become a master of applying these technologies to something for some purpose. He's able to use his judgment in such a way that these things are successful in actually producing more wealth for society in net effect than the cost of that production. That's a simple physical relationship, like the relationship of the individual mind to the discovery of a universal physical principle. Then you have the second aspect. Now let's suppose that you have a very intelligent fellow. He's plunked down somewhere on the planet. He's given a machine tool and so forth, all the materials needed to produce. Is that going to determine his productivity? No. What's going to determine his productivity is the educational system in which that population lives, the level of infrastructure, such as the production and distribution of power, the degree to which the environment is controlled by large-scale water management, by forestation, all these other things which are the conditions of life. The conditions of social life determine how productive the individual entrepreneur, the individual worker will be in society. So it is not from the individual labor as such that the wealth comes. The ability of man to produce more than the cost of production depends not only on the individual, it depends upon the conditions of life in society in which that individual operates. Therefore, we have the division in economy, which is modern national economy. The division between the activity of the individual as individual, using technologies or perfecting the application of technologies derived from universal physical principles, from the mind of the individual. The individual's mind's relationship to nature is the primary thing there. But that does not determine the productivity of labor. What determines the productivity of labor variably is the conditions of society in which this is done. So therefore you have in economy two things to consider. You have the local activity, and you also have then the organization of the
Okay. So this morning we heard the voices of those who represent the most important political movements in the 20th century, those of Gandhi and Dr. Martin Luther King. We had the fortune of listening to those voices this morning. The person whom I have the fortune of introducing represents not only a continuation of those political struggles, but is the only person who is equipped not only intellectually, but has the guts to deal with the current collapsing economic and cultural system. And believe me, I've done my research. His intellectual and political leadership has inspired leaders and young people across the world to fight for a new just world economic system. Through his strategic battles, he has severely crippled the efforts of Dick Cheney and other scumbags across the world. So without further introduction, I present to you the next President of the United States, Lyndon LaRouche.
Well, thank you, Jenny. Okay. Young fellows. Well, I shall deal with several things in the time allotted to me, and then the time allotted to you, you will ask me what you wish to. We divide things that way, and you get more time than I do. All right, first of all, the three things are first, the essential thing about economy in principle. Secondly, the second thing about economy, which is twofold, is the relationship of the economic activity of the individual or small firm to the community at large, the nation as a large, the world at large, and the social processes which connect the coordination of various individual or local activities into a national functioning whole. And then finally, I shall turn to the reasons why the synarchists exist and why there's such a danger. Then man becomes a victim of paper, and evil takes over. So the important thing is, how should we define the production of a necessary medium of exchange called money, or credit issued against money, or charge against the delivery of money? How should we measure that, and how should we control that? Well, obviously it has to be done by a sovereign government. Why? Because the process of production and distribution depends upon a relationship between the income of the individual or firm or entity which consumes and those who produce. In general, the objective is that the cost of production should be less than the price of the goods sold. But that's on the average. The root of this thing is very simple. The root of an economy is man. There's no economy among animals, including Arnold Schwarzenegger. There is no proper economy. An economy reflects a characteristic of people, of the human individual, the difference between the individual and the beast. That is, these cognitive powers by which we discover universal physical principles, derive new technologies or apply technology based on these principles. We apply them to our problems. And therefore we find that through our efforts, our physical efforts, or the expenditure of our time, that we are able to produce more wealth than it costs to keep us in the process of production, both in terms of our labor, in terms of the cost to maintain the families in which we come, but also in the cost to society of capital expenditures on which we rely, both in private industry and by government, including large-scale infrastructure, things of that sort. We rely upon this. Our productivity depends upon it. And therefore, it is the power of man to make discoveries and to use them. Discoveries derived from discovery of universal physical principles, which increases the value of what is produced over the cost of production. And therefore,